Good evening and welcome back to Wisdom by the Fireside. Tonight we sit together in the glow of the firelight, with a story not of kings or empires, but of a young girl whose courage defied armies, bullets, and death itself. This is a figures story, and in it, we follow the life of Malala Yousafzai, the girl who would not be silenced. In today's story, we are not here to list awards or rehearse speeches. We are here to step into the narrow valleys of Swat in northern Pakistan, where mountains loom high and shadows grow long, and where a child's dream of education turned into a war against terror. The Taliban wanted silence. God, however, had another plan. And so the question we begin with is this: when the world tries to silence you, does your voice die, or does it become eternal? Malala was born in 1997 in Mingora, the largest city of Swat Valley. To many outsiders, Swat was known for its beauty, its green fields, rushing rivers, and snow-capped peaks. But for the families who lived there, life was simple, fragile, and often bound by tradition. Her father, Malala Yousafzai, was unlike most men in his village. He believed in the power of words. He ran a small school, often with more dreams than resources, and he encouraged his daughter to learn, to question, and to speak. At night, while others in the village told stories of warriors, Ziauddin would tell Malala stories of books, poets, and prophets. It was unusual, even dangerous, to believe that a girl could stand equal to a boy in education. But from her earliest days, Malala absorbed this conviction like breath itself. Still, even in those peaceful early years, shadows were gathering. By the mid-2000s, the Taliban had begun to creep into Swat Valley. At first, they came as voices on the radio, stern men who condemned music, television, and above all, the education of girls. Then, they came as men with guns, filling the markets, closing schools, and issuing threats. For a child like Malala, the change was terrifying, yet invisible at first. The laughter of friends on the way to school still filled the air. But slowly, one by one, the doors to classrooms were shut. Girls stayed home. Dreams grew small. Imagine being 11 years old and being told, "Your classroom is gone. Your pen is forbidden. Your future is closed." Yet Malala, unlike many, did not accept it quietly. In 2009, when she was only 12, Malala began writing anonymously for the BBC under the pseudonym Gul Makai. Her diary captured the world's attention. The sound of bombs shaking her valley, the fear of wearing her school uniform, the haunting question of whether her classmates would live to see another day. Her words were simple, but they carried the weight of truth. And truth, as the Taliban knew, is more dangerous than any weapon. But writing in secret is one thing. Speaking openly, with her name and her face, is another. Malala began to appear on television, standing beside her father, advocating for a girl's right to learn. Her small voice was trembling but fierce, a candle in a windstorm. And every time she spoke, the Taliban heard her. It is easy, looking back, to see the arc of destiny. But in those days, Malala was still just a teenager. She liked cricket. She argued with her brothers. She dreamed of being a doctor, not a global icon. Yet something had begun. A seed was planted. And in the silence of Swat's dark nights, where fear reigned, the Taliban made lists of those they wanted gone. Her name was placed there. The girl with the book in her hand was now the enemy of men with guns. But here's the mystery we must hold on to tonight. Was it her courage alone that carried her forward? Or was God already 3 steps ahead? Because what came next would nearly end her life. But instead, it would turn her into a symbol no bullet could destroy. She thought the greatest test was losing her school. But the day was coming when the test would be her own heartbeat, her own breath, and whether she would ever open her eyes again. When Malala was still a child, long before the world knew her name, she sat at a small wooden desk in her father's school. The chalk dust hung in the air, sunlight slipped through the cracked windows, and she gripped her pencil as if it were the key to another world. Her father, Ziauddin, believed education was sacred. He was not a wealthy man, nor a powerful one, but his conviction was unshakable. One child, one teacher, one book, and one pen can change the world. It was not just an idea to him. It was a fire in his bones. He had been born into poverty, stammering as a boy, mocked for his speech. But he had fought through his stutter, climbed into poetry, and built a school so that others would never suffer the silence he had known. And he treated his daughter as though her dreams were no smaller than a son's. In Swat, this was rare. For many families, a girl's worth was measured in obedience, not ambition. Yet Malala was raised to believe she had a voice, and that her voice was worth hearing. Those early days were marked by innocence. Malala would wake to the sound of her brothers bickering, the call to prayer rising through the valley, and the chatter of classmates in narrow alleys on the way to school. She loved learning, but more than that, she loved knowing. One afternoon, she returned home from school, her eyes lit up. "Father," she asked, "why is it that some people treat girls as if they are less?" Her father's face grew serious. He bent down to her level. "Because they are afraid, Malala. Afraid of the power of an educated girl." Those words stayed with her. They were not merely comfort. They were prophecy. But shadows do not ask permission before they fall. By 2007, the Taliban had begun to tighten their grip on Swat Valley. At first, they spoke through the radio, their voices full of fire and condemnation. A man named Fazlullah preached that music was sin, television was corruption, and girls in classrooms were an offense against God. Some in the valley listened, others trembled. And slowly, the fear became visible. Shops selling CDs were shut down. Television sets were smashed, and girls' schools, one after another, were burned to the ground. Malala watched as the world she loved began to vanish. Yet in her home, her father refused to surrender. He held meetings in the dim light of his school, speaking out against extremism. He told his students that the Taliban's version of faith was a distortion, that God had given both men and women the right to knowledge. Malala sat quietly in the corner during those meetings, listening to the courage in his words. And in her small heart, a conviction grew. If her father would stand, so would she. But courage in Swat came at a cost. One morning, Malala awoke to the sound of an explosion. Dust filled the air outside, and neighbors shouted in panic. A girls' school nearby had been bombed. Parents wept in the streets. Little girls clutched their books, not knowing if they would ever carry them again. Malala held her own school bag tighter. She was 11. She understood that to carry her books now was not just a right, it was defiance. And with every step she took to her classroom, she wondered, would the Taliban come today? Would the sound of learning itself provoke their wrath? Still, she went. Still, she raised her hand in class. Still, she dreamed of becoming a doctor. And at night, when the valley was hushed under the stars, she would write in her notebook as if writing could preserve the very soul of her people. It is easy to forget that heroes do not wake up one morning knowing they are heroes. They grow step by step in the ordinary days of choosing courage over fear. Malala's days were ordinary: school, home, family meals, prayers. Yet in those ordinary days, her spirit was being tempered like steel. One evening, as her father returned home, weary but determined, Malala asked him, "Will they come for us, Baba?" He placed his hand on her head. "They may. But remember, Malala, courage is not being afraid. Courage is carrying on, even when you are." She did not know then that her own words would soon echo far beyond Swat, that the secret diary of a little girl would become a weapon more powerful than guns, and that her pen would draw the gaze of the world. The valley of Swat had grown quieter on the surface, but it was the silence of fear, not peace. Schools stood empty, blackened by fire. Girls were kept at home, told to forget their lessons. And yet, in the midst of this darkness, Malala found a secret way to let her voice travel beyond the mountains. In early 2009, the BBC Urdu service was looking for someone inside Swat who could write about life under Taliban rule. They wanted the perspective of a schoolgirl, someone who could describe how it felt to wake up each day with education forbidden. Most parents were too afraid. The risk was too high. But Ziauddin, Malala's father, did not hesitate. he offered his daughter. She was just 11. Her first entry was simple. She wrote about her fear of wearing her school uniform, about hiding her books under her shawl, about how each day she wondered if she would still be alive tomorrow. She signed the entries with a pseudonym, Gul Makai, the name of a heroine from Pashtun folklore. And so, under the cover of anonymity, Malala's words began to slip across borders. At night, by the dim light of a lamp, she would scribble in her notebook. She wrote of explosions that shook her valley awake, of friends leaving in fear, of classrooms reduced to rubble. Her sentences were short, plain, almost childlike. But perhaps it was that simplicity that gave them such force. One entry read, "I had a terrible dream yesterday with military helicopters and the Taliban. I have had such dreams since the launch of the military operation in Swat." Another, "On my way from school to home, I heard a man saying, 'I will kill you.' I hastened my pace, and after a while I looked back to see if the man was still coming behind me. But to my utter relief, he was talking on his mobile and must have been threatening someone else over the phone." Her fear was real, yet in every entry there was also resistance. The Taliban had guns, but she had a pen. Soon, her diary was being read around the world. Journalists quoted her. Readers from faraway countries were gripped by the thought of a child facing down armed men. Gul Makai became a symbol of defiance, though no one yet knew she was Malala. Her classmates whispered, wondering who could be writing such bold words. Malala kept her secret carefully, even as she noticed the danger closing in. Because with every word that traveled beyond Swat, the Taliban's anger grew, but she could not stop. "Why should I hide?" she once asked her father. "If I speak the truth, will they kill me?" Her father's eyes held both fear and pride. "They may try, Malala, but truth is stronger than bullets." By late 2009, Malala's secret was harder to keep. She was no longer just writing anonymously, she was beginning to speak openly. She appeared on local television programs, her voice high and earnest, declaring that girls had a right to education. It was a leap that changed everything. Writing in shadows gave her safety. Speaking in daylight put a target on her back. But she did it anyway. One evening, as the family ate together, her father said quietly, "Malala, your voice is powerful, but you must be careful. The Taliban are listening." She set down her spoon and looked at him. "Baba, if I'm silent, then nothing will change. If I speak, maybe someone will hear. Isn't that worth the risk?" It was a question few adults could have answered with such clarity. Yet this child asked it with the certainty of faith. What Malala did not know was that her words were already echoing in rooms she could not imagine. In news studios, in embassies, in the corridors of power. The world was listening, and the Taliban too were listening. In 2010, when she was invited to speak publicly about education, she stood on a stage in Peshawar. Her braids were neat, her voice steady. She spoke of the dream of every girl, to hold a book without fear, to walk to school without trembling. She was only 12, but already she carried herself like a leader. Yet every act of courage in Swat carried a shadow. For every speech she gave, the whispers of death grew louder. Her friends warned her. Neighbors cautioned her father. The Taliban had a list, and her name was climbing higher. Still, she wrote. Still, she spoke. Still, she dreamed. Because Malala believed something many grown men had forgotten, that God gives strength even to the smallest voices, and that sometimes the weak are chosen to humble the mighty. But destiny does not wait. And one afternoon, as she rode the bus home from school, the test she had feared all along would finally come for her. A man with a gun would call her name. And in that moment, history would split in two, before the bullet and after. It was October 9th, 2012. The day began like many others. The air in Mingora carried the faint chill of autumn, and Malala gathered her books, wrapped her shawl, and headed for school. She was 15 now, older than when she first began writing for the BBC, but still a girl, playful, curious, dreaming of her next test in class. Her morning was ordinary. Lessons, laughter with friends, a glance through a textbook that promised more than numbers and words. It promised a future. When the final bell rang, she and her classmates piled into a small white pickup truck used as a school bus. They sat close together, their chatter filling the air, the road winding through the valley toward their homes. For Malala, it was just another ride. For history, it was the moment everything changed. As the bus moved through a narrow street, it slowed at a checkpoint. A man climbed aboard. He wore a cap low over his face, and in his hand was a pistol. His eyes scanned the girls. "Which one of you is Malala?" he demanded. For a moment, the world froze. Some girls looked at her. Others kept their eyes down, hearts racing. Then, without hesitation, he fired. One bullet struck Malala in the head, passing through her skull. Another wounded her friend. Screams erupted. The bus shook with terror. Books fell to the floor. Blood spread across the seat. The man vanished as quickly as he had come, and in his wake, he left silence. Malala slumped forward, unconscious. Her classmates screamed, trying to rouse her. "Malala! Malala!" But her eyes did not open. She was rushed to a small hospital in Mingora. Doctors scrambling, parents rushing to her side, her father broken with fear. News spread quickly. First through the valley, then across Pakistan, then across the world. The girl who had spoken for education had been shot in the head for daring to dream. The Taliban thought the bullet would end her voice, but instead, it unleashed a storm. That night, prayers rose from every corner of Swat. Neighbors lit candles, mothers wept, fathers clenched their fists. The radio, once a tool of Taliban fear, now carried the news that the girl they had tried to silence was fighting for her life. Doctors worked desperately, but her condition was critical. She was moved to a military hospital in Peshawar, where surgeons removed the bullet fragments and worked to reduce the swelling in her brain. For days, her life hung by a thread. Ziauddin stood at her bedside, his heart torn. He whispered, "Ya Allah, do not take her from me. Spare her life. She has more to do." But Malala herself knew nothing of those frantic hours. She lay in darkness, unconscious, her body fragile, her future uncertain. And yet, in that silence, something unseen was at work. Because against every medical prediction, against the hopes of the men who pulled the trigger, Malala lived. When she finally woke up, it was not in Pakistan but in Birmingham, England, where she had been flown for advanced care. Tubes covered her face. Machines hummed beside her bed. She could not speak, could not even smile. But she was alive. And in her survival, millions saw something greater than medicine. They saw the hand of God. The Taliban's message had been clear: to kill one girl, to frighten thousands. But the result was the opposite. Instead of silence, there was uproar. Instead of fear, there was fury. Instead of Malala's voice being extinguished, it was amplified to every corner of the globe. Nations condemned the attack. Leaders spoke her name. Newspapers across the world carried her face on their front pages. A child who had been shot for wanting a book. The men with guns had wanted to erase her. Instead, they had written her name into history. In those first fragile days of recovery, Malala could not yet know the power of what had happened. She could not see the rallies held in her honor, or the millions of signatures on petitions demanding education for girls, or the prayers said for her in languages she had never heard. All she knew was pain, confusion, and the long road back to her voice. But here lies the question at the heart of her story. Was the bullet meant to end her life? Or was it the very spark that God would use to set her destiny aflame? Because in the days ahead, Malala would discover that survival was not the end of her struggle. It was the beginning of her true mission. The first thing Malala remembered after the darkness was light, harsh, clinical light above her, the soft hum of machines around her, and the weight of something heavy in her throat. She tried to speak, but no words came. Panic rose in her chest, until a nurse leaned over gently, explaining with her eyes more than words. She had survived, but she was not in Pakistan anymore. It was Birmingham, England, thousands of miles from Swat. Her hand shook as she reached for a notepad. She scribbled her first question. Where is my father? Her father, Ziauddin, was there, Soon after, his eyes full of tears, he bent to her ear and whispered, "You are alive, Malala. Alhamdulillah. God has spared you." The road ahead was brutal. The bullet had damaged her skull, her face partially paralyzed. Surgeries followed one after another to repair nerves, to place a titanium plate, to help her hear again. Each procedure was a reminder of what had been stolen, but also of what had been preserved. Doctors spoke of miracle margins, of survival rates that had been nearly impossible. To many, it was science. To Malala and her family, it was more. It was providence. Still, survival was not without its cost. She often awoke confused, angry, frustrated at her silence. She looked in the mirror and saw scars, not the girl she remembered. She asked herself in the quiet of night, "Why me? Why am I alive when others are gone?" Meanwhile, the world outside her hospital room had transformed her into something larger than herself. Vigils were held in London, New York, and Islamabad. Children carried signs that read, "I am Malala." Politicians who had once been silent about Taliban violence now spoke with sudden urgency. The United Nations declared November 10th as Malala Day, honoring her struggle for education. But Malala, still weak in her hospital bed, felt conflicted. She was just a girl, she thought. She still dreamed of becoming a doctor. She still argued with her brothers about silly things. She wondered if people would ever see her as human again, not just a symbol. Her father tried to reassure her. "Malala, this is your destiny. God saved you for a reason. Your life was spared so you could speak not just for yourself, but for millions." Her mother, more cautious, whispered, "But she is still my child. She needs rest, not burden." And between their voices, Malala lay silently, caught between two worlds. The private world of a daughter and sister, and the public world of a symbol and leader. As the weeks passed, visitors came. Journalists, diplomats, activists. They all wanted to see the girl who defied bullets. Malala smiled politely, but inside, she wrestled with the truth. She had not chosen this fame. It had been forced upon her by violence. One evening, when the nurses had left and the hospital corridors grew quiet, Malala prayed. She thanked God for life, for her father's courage, for her mother's love. But she also asked, trembling, "Why me, Lord? Why did you let me live? Am I strong enough to carry what you are asking of me?" It was a prayer many prophets and saints had whispered before. The cry of someone chosen not by ambition, but by suffering. Slowly, her strength returned. She learned to speak again, her words halting at first, then stronger. She stood for the first time, her legs trembling but her will steady. And with every step forward, she felt the weight of the world pressing closer. The Taliban had wanted her gone. Instead, she was now the most famous teenager on Earth. But with fame came fear. Letters arrived threatening her life, even in England. She wondered if the shadow of danger would ever leave her. Yet alongside the fear came letters of love. Little girls from Africa, Asia, and America writing, "Because of you, I want to go to school." And in those words, Malala began to understand. Survival was not an accident. It was a calling. She could have chosen silence. She could have hidden, healed, and lived quietly. But Malala would soon make a decision that would define her forever. To take the wound meant to silence her and turn it into the loudest cry for education the world had ever heard. The doctors had warned her to take things slowly. Rest, rebuild, recover. But inside Malala, something stirred restlessly. She had not survived a bullet to return to silence. As she regained her strength, her father reminded her again and again, "You were saved for a purpose, Malala. Do not let fear decide what you do next." At first, she hesitated. What if the Taliban found her again? What if another man boarded another bus? What if her survival only brought danger to her family? These fears were real, gnawing at her like shadows in the night. But then came the letters, piling high at the hospital. Messages from children across the globe. "Because of you, I want to be a teacher. You give me courage to go to school." "You are not alone, Malala." And she realized the voice she once thought small had grown into something larger than herself. Her first step back into the public eye came in early 2013, when she and her family were settled in Birmingham. Journalists crowded outside their modest home, hungry for her first words. Malala's voice was still soft, her English careful, but her conviction was unshaken. "I want every child to go to school," she said. "I want education for the sons and daughters of the Taliban and for all the children of the world." It was not bitterness she offered, but vision, not revenge, but mercy. And in that moment, many who listened felt the strange, unmistakable echo of something divine. The weak confounding the strong, light shining out of wounds. The defining moment came a few months later, on July 12, 2013, her 16th birthday. Malala was invited to speak at the United Nations headquarters in New York. The date would forever be known as Malala Day. She walked onto the stage, dressed in a pink shawl that once belonged to Benazir Bhutto, the assassinated Pakistani leader. Her face bore scars, her voice carried both tremor and fire. The room fell silent as she began, "They thought that the bullets would silence us, but they failed." And out of that silence came thousands of voices. She spoke of education as the only weapon that could change the world. She spoke of books and pens as more powerful than guns. She declared that one child, one teacher, one book, and one pen could indeed transform the future. Her words were not shouted. They were delivered calmly, steadily, like a prayer. And yet, in their steadiness, they carried the force of an earthquake. World leaders applauded. Children watching on television felt hope rise in their chests. And the Taliban, hearing of her speech, realized their attempt at erasure had made her immortal. But behind the applause, Malala still wrestled with questions. Lying awake that night in her hotel room, she whispered a prayer, "God, I'm only 16. The world is listening, but am I ready? Am I enough?" Her mother tucked the blanket around her, saying, "Daughter, you're not speaking alone. Every girl denied her education is speaking through you. God is with you." And in that reassurance, Malala found the strength to continue. The world had now given her a platform. But platforms bring scrutiny. Not everyone admired her. Some accused her of being a Western puppet. Others claimed she had betrayed her homeland by speaking abroad. She read the criticisms, and they cut deep. Yet she remembered the faces of her classmates back in Swat, girls who had no schools, no voice, no future. She remembered the sound of the gunman asking, "Who is Malala?" And she knew the answer. "I am Malala, and I cannot be silent." By choosing to speak again, Malala crossed a threshold she could never return from. She was no longer just the girl from Swat Valley. She was the face of a global movement. And with that choice came a new burden: how to remain Malala, the daughter and student, while becoming Malala, the symbol and leader. But fate was not done shaping her path, because soon the recognition would come that would forever place her name in history's book of honor and test whether her humility could survive the weight of glory. It was a crisp October morning in 2014 when the news broke. Malala Yousafzai, just 17 years old, had been awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. She was the youngest recipient in history. The announcement rippled across the globe. In schools, children cheered. In parliaments, leaders applauded. In homes, parents whispered her name as a prayer for their daughters. The girl who had once hidden her school books under her shawl was now holding the world's highest honor for peace. But for Malala, the moment was not triumphal. It was surreal. She was still in class when the announcement came, still a student with homework waiting on her desk. A classmate nudged her, whispering, "Malala, you've just won the Nobel Prize." She smiled shyly, almost embarrassed. For all the cameras flashing outside, she still felt like the girl who loved her textbooks more than titles. When she walked onto the stage in Oslo to accept the award, she wore a simple red shawl, her voice calm but steady. She did not speak of herself. Instead, she spoke of children. "This award is not just for me," she said. "It is for those forgotten children who want education. It is for those frightened children who want peace. It is for those voiceless children who want change. The hall fell silent, her words cutting through the air like a bell. But behind the grace of that moment, Malala carried a burden invisible to the cameras. With fame came expectations. Leaders sought her endorsement. Organizations pulled at her time. Journalists demanded interviews. Every word she spoke was weighed, dissected, politicized. And at only 17, she often felt the crushing weight of being called a symbol instead of being seen as a girl. In private, she confessed to her father, "Baba, sometimes I just want to be Malala. Not Malala, the Nobel laureate. Not Malala, the global voice. Just Malala." Her father placed his hand on her shoulder. "You are Malala, and that is enough. Do not let the world steal your soul while praising your name." Her struggle was not just external, but spiritual. One evening, alone in her room, she prayed, "God, you spared me once. You lifted me up. But am I worthy of this honor? Do I deserve this voice when so many others are silenced forever? Please guide me to use it well." It was not the prayer of a celebrity. It was the cry of a servant, a girl who feared pride more than death. With the Nobel Prize, the world expected grandeur. But Malala's first act was quiet, almost childlike. She used the prize money to begin building schools for girls in Pakistan and beyond. It was as if she wanted to prove that the medal was not hers, but theirs. And with each new school, her message deepened. True peace does not come from prizes, but from classrooms filled with children who can dream freely. Yet the contradictions of fame lingered. Back in Pakistan, some accused her of betraying her culture. Online, critics spread conspiracy theories, calling her achievements manufactured. The bullet had made her famous, they said, not her courage. These words hurt more than the scars on her body. Some nights she lay awake, her heart heavy, asking, "Do they not see my sincerity? Do they not believe my love for home?" But then, she remembered the faces of girls she had met in refugee camps, carrying books with trembling hands. She remembered the letters tucked under her pillow from children who said she gave them courage. And she knew the truth. Even if the world doubted, God had preserved her life for this very work. The Nobel Prize did not end her story. It magnified it. And with magnification came a deeper test. Whether Malala could hold on to humility, faith, and her own identity while standing under the blinding glare of global recognition. Because fame does not always bring peace. And behind the applause and ceremonies, Malala would face her hardest struggle yet. Not against the Taliban, not against bullets, but against the quiet erosion of her own soul. From the outside, it looked like Malala's life was a story of triumph without shadows. She had survived the Taliban's bullet. She had spoken at the United Nations. She had won the Nobel Peace Prize. Cameras followed her, leaders sought her, and millions admired her. But inside, she often felt like a girl trapped between two worlds. In one world, she was still Malala of Swat, the daughter who teased her brothers, the student who lost herself in books, the girl who longed for the smell of her mother's cooking and the sound of her valley's river. In the other world, she was Malala the symbol, the girl whose face appeared on magazine covers, whose words echoed in parliaments, whose name carried both hope and controversy. And between those two worlds, she sometimes felt very alone. She once confessed to her father, "Baba, they call me a symbol, but do they remember I'm still human?" Her father looked at her with deep sadness. "Symbols are lonely, Malala, but you are more than a symbol to God. You are his servant. Never forget that." It was advice that soothed, yet did not erase the ache. At Oxford, where she pursued her studies, Malala tried to live like an ordinary student. She attended lectures, ate in the cafeteria, and made friends who treated her not as a Nobel laureate, but simply as Malala. She laughed, she studied late into the night, she stressed about exams, and yet she could never fully escape the shadow of her fame. When she raised her hand in class, some classmates looked at her not as a peer, but as the girl who defied the Taliban. When she walked through campus, strangers sometimes whispered her name. She longed for invisibility, for a day when she could walk unnoticed. But her life no longer allowed it. Even in moments of joy, there was grief. She carried the memories of friends from Swat who had not survived. She carried the weight of girls still forbidden to learn. And sometimes, that weight grew heavy. One night, overwhelmed by exhaustion, she prayed, "Ya Allah, I did not ask for this. I only asked for a classroom. Why did you give me a stage? Why me when so many are stronger, wiser, more deserving?" The prayer lingered in the silence. No lightning struck, no voice answered. But in the stillness, she felt the same whisper that had carried her since the bullet. Because you would not be silent. Because the weak must sometimes be chosen to humble the mighty. Her greatest challenge was not her critics, nor her wounds, nor even the Taliban who still cursed her name. It was the danger of losing herself. The world wanted her to be flawless, always brave, always wise, always saintly. But Malala knew she was human. She doubted, she tired. She sometimes wanted to lay down her pen. And in that honesty lay her truest courage. Not the absence of fear, but the refusal to let fear or weariness define her. One afternoon, she wrote in her journal, "I am Malala, but I'm also just Malala, and perhaps God is teaching me that the two must live together." It was a reminder that she did not need to choose between being a girl and being a symbol. She only needed to remain faithful to the voice that God had preserved, her own. But destiny was not finished with her yet, because soon her journey would test her in a new way, not on a stage, not under a spotlight, but in the quiet decision of what to do with her life after Oxford. Would she chase power, or would she continue the path of service? Graduation day at Oxford was supposed to feel like an ending. Robes swayed, cameras clicked, families embraced their children with pride. Malala stood among them, smiling for photos, clutching her degree in philosophy, politics, and economics. But for her, this was not an ending. It was another beginning. The world expected her next chapter to be extraordinary. Some assumed she would run for office, perhaps one day become a prime minister. Others imagined her as the head of a major global organization, her voice commanding stages and summits. The pressure was heavy. Yet in her heart, Malala was not chasing titles. She still held on to the same dream that began in the Swat Valley: to build classrooms, to give children a chance to learn. She had walked the corridors of Oxford, yes, but she remembered the girls of Swat, who had no corridors to walk at all. So, while her peers sent resumes to corporations or political offices, Malala quietly expanded the Malala Fund, the nonprofit she co-founded with her father. Its mission was simple but enormous: to ensure 12 years of free, safe, quality education for every girl. It was not glamorous work. Meetings dragged on, fundraising was difficult, critics questioned her methods. But Malala persisted. For her, every new school built, every girl enrolled, was a victory worth more than applause. Still, fame followed her. She was invited to conferences where billionaires and presidents spoke. She sat on panels where every word she uttered was dissected. And sometimes, as she looked across those glittering rooms, she wondered, am I still the girl from Swat? Or have I become someone the Valley would not recognize? It was a haunting thought, because Malala never wanted to leave Swat behind, yet circumstances had forced her into exile. She longed for the mountains, for her mother's garden, for the river's sound at night. But returning was dangerous. The Taliban had never retracted their threats. So she lived between worlds, building schools for Pakistan from London, carrying her homeland in her heart, but not under her feet. Then came a new question, one she had never considered before: marriage. In 2021, Malala surprised the world by announcing her marriage to Asir Malik, a cricket official from Pakistan. Many celebrated, but others criticized, as they always did. For Malala, the choice was deeply personal. After years of being seen as a public figure, she wanted something ordinary. love, companionship, a family of her own. When asked why she chose Asser, she smiled softly. Because he sees me as Malala, not as the Nobel laureate. And in that, she found something precious, the reminder that even symbols need to be held as humans. Yet, even in her private joys, the public burdens remained. Wars broke out in different corners of the world. Refugee crises grew. Girls continued to be denied schools, from Afghanistan to Nigeria. And everywhere she went, people asked the same question. Malala, what will you do about it? It was overwhelming. She was just one woman. She could not fix the world alone. But she returned to the same prayer that had carried her since the bus. God, use my voice. Make it enough. And slowly she came to see that her role was not to be the savior of all, but the spark that lit others into action. One afternoon, while visiting a refugee camp in Jordan, she sat with a young Syrian girl who clutched a tattered notebook. The girl whispered, "Because of you, I still go to school. Because of you, I believe I can be a teacher." Tears welled in Malala's eyes. In that moment, she understood. Her legacy would not be measured in speeches or prizes, but in the quiet ripple of children who picked up pens because she had refused to put hers down. But history is never finished. And for Malala, the question still remains, how do you carry both the scars of the past and the hopes of the future without breaking under the weight? Because even as she builds schools and speaks of peace, the shadows of her homeland and the unfinished fight for girls' education still call her name. It was March 2018 when Malala finally set foot in Pakistan again. 6 years had passed since the bullet. 6 years of exile. 6 years of longing for the mountains and rivers of Swat. She stepped off the plane in Islamabad under heavy security. Armed guards surrounded her, cameras flashed, officials rushed to greet her. But her eyes searched for something beyond politics and protocol. She wanted to feel the soil, to breathe the air of home. "I never wanted to leave Pakistan," she told reporters through tears. "It was the Taliban who forced me out. Today, I am home again." Her words cracked with emotion. Behind her composure was a flood of memory. The bus, the gun, the hospital, the ocean of distance. And yet, here she stood again, her shawl wrapped tightly, her voice trembling but steady. The homecoming was not without risk. Threats still lingered. The Taliban issued statements condemning her return. Some accused her of betraying her people by speaking abroad. Security was tight, her movements limited. But Malala did not come for politics. She came for the children. When she visited her old school in Mingora, her classmates, now young women, wept and embraced her. Some had continued their studies. Others had been forced to marry. Many told her, "We kept learning because of you." Walking through those familiar hallways, Malala felt both joy and sorrow. Joy that education had survived in Swat. Sorrow that too many girls were still denied it. In a meeting with officials, she pressed for reforms. More schools, more funding, safer classrooms. They nodded politely, but she knew promises were fragile things in politics. Still, she spoke, because silence had never been an option. One night during her visit, she stood on a rooftop in Mingora, looking out at the valley where she had once dreamed as a little girl. The mountains stood silent, as if guarding her story. Tears filled her eyes as she whispered, "Ya Allah, let me return here, not with guards, but with peace. Let every girl walk free in these streets with her book in hand." But even in her homeland, divisions ran deep. Some hailed her as a daughter of Pakistan, a source of pride. Others, influenced by propaganda and fear, dismissed her as an agent of the West. It hurt. But Malala had learned something in her years abroad. You cannot control the voices of others, only the faithfulness of your own. Her return to Pakistan was brief, only a few days, but its significance was eternal. It was a reminder that her struggle was not just global, not just symbolic, but deeply personal. For Malala, Pakistan was not an idea. It was her home, her birthplace, her valley, her people. And no matter where life carried her, her heart remained tethered to its soil. Before leaving, she visited the graves of those who had been lost in Taliban violence. Standing among the markers, she prayed silently, her hand pressed to her chest. "Forgive me if I am not enough. Give me the strength to honor their memory." And as she left, she carried with her a truth sharper than ever. The bullet had not ended her life, but it had forever bound her to a mission larger than herself. But here lies the hardest truth. To fight for peace is not only to confront enemies with guns, it is to confront indifference, apathy, and the slow erosion of hope. And Malala would discover that sometimes the quieter battles are the hardest to win. For all her awards, speeches, and travels, Malala learned quickly that the greatest resistance was not always from men with guns. Sometimes it came from words, whispers, and the heavy silence of inaction. At international conferences, leaders clapped when she spoke. They nodded at her pleas for education. But once the lights dimmed and the cameras left, promises dissolved into empty air. Funding was cut. Policies stalled, wars continued. Malala began to realize the applause of the powerful did not always mean progress for the powerless. And then there were the critics, voices from home and abroad who questioned her motives. In Pakistan, some accused her of dishonoring her country by exposing its wounds before the world. Others spread lies that her shooting had been staged. Online, strangers mocked her accent, her clothes, even her prayers. Every insult was like a stone thrown into her spirit. She tried to ignore them, but late at night, scrolling through the venom on social media, she sometimes wept quietly. "Why do they hate me for wanting girls to learn?" she asked her mother one evening. Her mother pressed her hands and replied softly, "Because your truth makes them face their lies, and that is something many hearts cannot bear." But the hardest battle was within herself. There were days when she questioned whether her voice was truly making a difference. The Taliban still existed. Girls were still banned from schools in Afghanistan. In Nigeria, Boko Haram kidnapped schoolgirls by the hundreds. The world kept breaking no matter how many speeches she gave. One evening, exhausted after a long trip, she confided to her father, "Baba, I feel like I am pouring water into the desert. The thirst is endless. Am I really changing anything?" Her father looked at her with weary but steady eyes. "Malala, you are not asked to fill the desert. You are asked to bring water to one child at a time. That is enough. Let God handle the desert." Those words sank deep. She began to understand that change was not a thunderclap. It was a slow drip, steady and unseen, but powerful enough to carve stone over time. And sometimes she caught glimpses of that carving. A girl in Kenya who started a literacy program because she was inspired by Malala. A refugee in Lebanon who said Malala's story gave her courage to keep studying. A group of boys in Swat who declared that their sisters should go to school because Malala showed us they are equal. These were not headlines, but they were victories, and they were proof that her struggle was not in vain. Still, the weight of being Malala remained heavy. She was praised as a hero, yet often felt fragile. She was celebrated as a symbol, yet longed for simplicity. She was called fearless, yet still carried the fear that one day another gunman might find her. In her journal, she wrote, "Perhaps the hardest part of surviving the bullet is living up to what the world expects me to be afterward." But what Malala did not yet realize was that her story was not only about defiance, survival, or even education. It was about something deeper. How faith sustains a soul when applause fades. How God's plan can turn even wounds into blessings. And how the true battle is not for fame, but for the unseen future of children she may never meet. In the quiet moments away from stages and cameras, Malala often turned to prayer. The world saw her as confident, fearless, unshaken. But in private, she was still a young woman grappling with questions larger than herself. At night, in her small room in Birmingham, she would kneel on her prayer mat, whispering into the silence, "Ya Allah, why did you spare me? What is it you want me to do? Am I strong enough? Am I worthy of this path?" These were not doubts of faith, but doubts of self, the questions of someone who understood that survival was not a gift to be taken lightly. Sometimes she remembered the face of the gunman, blurred and fleeting. She did not know his name, only his intent. In her heart, she asked, "Was he my test, Lord? Did you place him before me to awaken something I did not yet know I carried?" The thought was unsettling but powerful. She began to see her life not just as chance, but as divine choreography, a story written long before she took her first breath. Her faith also guided her response to hatred. Many expected her to carry anger, to curse the Taliban, to demand revenge, but she could not. "I do not hate the man who shot me," she told an interviewer once. "I even pray for him, because hatred is heavy, and I will not let his darkness extinguish my light." These words startled many. How could a girl who had nearly died offer compassion to her attacker? But Malala's faith taught her that forgiveness was not weakness. It was strength. Yet forgiveness did not mean forgetting. She still bore the scars. She still carried the memory of friends silenced by violence. She still lived with the reality that her life had been ripped open and rewritten by a single trigger. Faith did not erase pain, but it gave her the strength to transform it. One day, while visiting a school rebuilt in Pakistan, a little girl clutched her hand and asked shyly, "Malala, were you afraid when they hurt you?" Malala knelt to meet her eyes. "Yes, I was afraid," she said softly. "But I remembered that fear does not last forever. Courage does, and God was with me." The girl's eyes widened and she held her book tighter. That small exchange reminded Malala of her mission, to plant courage where fear had taken root. But even with faith, Malala wrestled with moral questions that had no easy answers. Would her story overshadow the countless other girls who suffered without recognition? Was her survival fair when others died? Could she ever repay the gift of her life spared? She wrote in her journal, "Perhaps my survival is not mine at all. Perhaps it belongs to those I speak for. If so, then every day must be lived as service, not for myself, but for the millions who cannot speak." But living as a symbol of hope comes at a cost. And Malala would soon realize that even as she carried faith and purpose, she also had to guard against the danger of losing her own humanity in the process. Because to serve the world, she first had to remember how to simply live as Malala. The world often imagined Malala as tireless, always giving speeches, meeting presidents, building schools. But behind the headlines, she was still a daughter, a sister, and a young woman trying to live a life that belonged to her. At Oxford, she had fought to carve out moments of normalcy. She joined friends for tea, attended parties quietly, even worried about grades. But no matter how ordinary she tried to be, the extraordinary followed her. A selfie request in the library, a newspaper article dissecting her clothes, a stranger whispering, "That's Malala." She smiled politely, but inside she wondered, will I ever be allowed to just be me? Marriage to Asser in 2021 gave her a glimpse of that private humanity she craved. With him, she could laugh without judgment, argue about cricket scores, and feel like Malala the person, not Malala the icon. In an interview after her wedding, she said softly, "It is strange to be celebrated by the world, but known truly by so few. Asser reminds me that before I am a symbol, I am human. I am a wife, a daughter, a sister." It was a reminder she desperately needed, because fame had a way of stealing identity, of turning a soul into a brand. And Malala fought to keep her soul intact. Her family remained her anchor. Her mother, still shy of cameras, kept her grounded with simple wisdom. "Fame fades, daughter," she would say, while stirring lentils in the kitchen, "but kindness remains. Be kind first, always." Her brothers teased her mercilessly, refusing to treat her like a Nobel laureate. "You may have a medal," one said, "but you still can't cook rice without burning it." She laughed, grateful for their ordinary cruelty. In those moments, she remembered who she was beyond the microphones. But balancing public duty and private life was never easy. She often traveled for weeks, missing family milestones. She sat in conference rooms while longing to be home. The work was endless: petitions, speeches, meetings, policy drafts. And though she gave it her all, there were nights when she collapsed onto her bed, whispering, "Ya Allah, am I enough? Am I giving too much to the world and not enough to those I love?" It was a question that haunted her, because service, noble as it was, carried the danger of emptiness if it consumed everything else. Her faith reminded her that balance was also sacred. The Prophet, peace be upon him, had taught that family, rest, and joy were parts of worship too. Malala clung to that truth. She reminded herself that to serve well, she had to live well. So she began to guard small moments: quiet dinners with her husband, long calls with her mother, laughter with old friends. These moments were not wasted time. They were the fuel that kept her spirit alive. Still, she remained painfully aware that her life was not entirely her own. She carried the expectations of millions. Every choice she made, what to wear, what to say, where to go, was scrutinized. And yet, she learned to breathe within that scrutiny, to smile at the noise, to anchor herself not in opinion but in purpose. But destiny has a way of testing balance. And soon, Malala would be confronted again with the stark reminder that her mission was far from complete. A new wave of oppression would rise. And once again, she would be called not just to speak, but to stand. It was August 2021 when the world watched in shock. Kabul had fallen, and the Taliban once again ruled Afghanistan. For Malala, the news was not just political, it was personal. Memories of her own valley under Taliban control came rushing back. The fear, the closures, the silence of classrooms. And now, millions of Afghan girls faced the same darkness she had lived through. She sat before her television, her heart pounding. Young women in Kabul stood at school gates, turned away by armed men. Mothers wept in the streets. Fathers begged in vain. The sight was unbearable. She whispered to herself, "Not again. Ya Allah, not again." Within hours, journalists called for her response. World leaders waited for her voice. She wrote on Twitter, "I cannot help but cry today. Afghan girls and women are once again being told they cannot dream, cannot learn, cannot live freely. We cannot allow this to continue." But her statement was more than words. She mobilized the Malala Fund, pressing governments to act, urging the international community not to abandon Afghan women. In interviews, her voice carried both fire and grief. "We made promises to Afghan girls. We told them the world was changing. And now we watch as those promises are broken. This is not just politics. It is betrayal." Privately, the pain was heavier still. She confided to Asser one evening, tears in her eyes, "It feels like the bullet is chasing me again. Different country, same story. I survived, but what about them? Who will save them?" Her husband held her hands. "Perhaps God saved you to be their voice, Malala, to remind the world not to look away." Those words struck deep. She realized that her story was not hers alone. It was tied to every girl facing locked doors and broken promises. And so, she returned to the battlefield of words. She met with global leaders, pressing them to condition aid on education rights. She appeared on world stages, reminding the powerful that denying girls education was not just oppression. It was a sin against God's gift of knowledge. Her words were sharp, but her heart remained tender. "I do not want Afghan girls to have to be as brave as I had to be," she said. "I want them to simply walk to school without fear. Why is that too much to ask?" Still, she knew her voice was not enough. She had learned that the world often listens for a moment, then moves on. But she refused to let it move on quietly. She kept speaking, kept writing, kept meeting, even when it seemed like little changed. Because to her, silence was worse than failure. One day she received a letter from an Afghan teenager. The girl wrote, "They closed my school, but I read in secret. I hide my books under the floorboards. I remember your story, and I know I must not give up. If you survived, maybe we will too." Malala wept as she read, It was a reminder that her fight, even when it felt endless, was planting seeds unseen. But here's the paradox of her journey. The more Malala gave to the world, the more she risked losing herself. And as she continued to fight for millions, she would be forced to ask the hardest question yet. How do you keep your soul alive while carrying the weight of so many others? For years, Malala had poured herself into speeches, schools, and struggles. She had stood before presidents and parliaments, walked refugee camps, sat with grieving mothers. She gave the world her words, her time, her strength. But giving so much came at a price. There were days she woke exhausted, her chest heavy, her smile forced. Nights when she stared at the ceiling, her thoughts racing. Am I doing enough? Am I letting the world down? Am I letting God down? The applause of audiences could not soothe the quiet ache of burnout. She began to feel like she was living in fragments. A piece for the activists, a piece for the journalists, a piece for the children who looked to her like a savior. But what piece was left for Malala herself? In one interview, a reporter asked her, "How do you stay so strong?" She smiled politely, but inside, she wanted to answer, "I don't. I cry, I doubt, I feel small." Because strength was not her constant state. It was her daily choice. She found herself returning again and again to prayer. Not grand, eloquent prayers, but quiet ones whispered in exhaustion. Ya Allah, I am tired. I am weak. Please, carry what I cannot. Give me rest in your mercy. And slowly she began to realize that she was not asked to save the world. She was asked to be faithful in her corner of it. Her father reminded her, Malala the prophet, peace be upon him, taught us balance. Even he rested, even he laughed with his family. You cannot burn yourself to give light. You must also be warmed by the flame. Those words were like water to her weary soul. She began to create boundaries. She guarded evenings for her family, days for herself. She learned to say no to some requests, even when guilt gnawed at her. And in those small acts of rest, she found her strength returning. With her husband, she rediscovered joy in simple things, walking through a park, cooking badly and laughing at the burnt results, watching cricket matches without thinking of the next speech. These moments were not distractions. They were medicine. But still, the larger mission loomed, and Malala knew that if she did not care for her soul, she would one day collapse under the weight of the expectations placed on her shoulders. So she held tight to faith, not as an escape, but as an anchor. God saved me once, she reminded herself, and he continues to save me every day I choose to stand, even when I feel like sitting down. In the silence of her prayers, she discovered a truth that steadied her. Survival was not just a one-time miracle. It was a daily miracle. Each breath, each choice to rise again, each moment of courage drawn from weakness. And that realization gave her peace. But even as Malala learned to guard her soul, the world's gaze remained fixed on her. And soon, she would face a question not of survival or service, but of legacy. What would remain of Malala when the speeches ended, when the headlines faded, when time itself had passed her by? The world knew Malala as the girl who defied bullets, as the youngest Nobel laureate, as a voice for millions. But as she grew older, she found herself asking a quieter, deeper question. When I'm gone, what will remain? Legacy was not something she had sought. She had once only wanted a classroom, a teacher, a desk to write on. But the bullet had changed everything. And now, her name was tied to history. Still, she wondered, would her story inspire only in the present, fading when headlines shifted? Or could it ripple forward, shaping lives she would never meet? One evening, sitting with her father after a long trip, she asked, Baba, how do you know if your life has truly mattered? He smiled, his face lined with both pride and fatigue. You do not measure it, Malala. You trust. A teacher does not always see the fruit of his lessons, but he plants seeds. Legacy is not what you see. It is what grows after you. Malala sat in silence, letting his words settle. She thought of the seeds, planted in refugee camps, in classrooms, in villages, seeds watered not by medals, but by hope. She began to see legacy not as monuments or statues, but as children carrying books into the future. Every girl who learned to read, every boy who respected his sister's right to learn, every family that chose courage over fear, that was her legacy. But still, she felt the weight of responsibility. "What if I am not enough?" she asked Asser one night. He held her hand gently. "Your task was never to be enough. Your task was to be faithful. The rest belongs to God." Those words gave her a sense of release. Her survival, her mission, even her legacy. None were hers to control fully. They were threads in a tapestry God Himself was weaving. And yet, she was not passive. She worked to ensure her legacy was built on more than speeches. Through the Malala Fund, she helped establish schools, train teachers, and advocate for policy changes that would outlast her lifetime. She wanted her work to live not in applause, but in infrastructure, in systems, in lives permanently changed. But in her reflections, another truth struck her. Legacy was not only about the world, it was about the soul. What will remain of me before God, she asked herself. When I stand before Him, will He say I used the life He spared well? Or will I have wasted it chasing noise? That question pierced deeper than any award. It kept her humble, kept her awake, kept her clinging to faith. One afternoon, while speaking to a group of young activists, she said something that captured her new understanding. Do not fight for legacy. Fight for truth. Legacy is what God writes with your life after you are gone. The room fell silent, because in her voice they heard not the certainty of a symbol, but the humility of a servant. But her journey was not finished yet, because as she reflected on legacy, another trial began to stir, the trial of time itself. How do you continue carrying a mission when the world's attention moves elsewhere? Would Malala's voice still echo when the spotlight dimmed? Fame, Malala learned, is like the wind, strong one day, gone the next. When she was shot, the world knew her name overnight. When she won the Nobel Prize, headlines crowned her the voice of a generation. But as years passed, new crises erupted, new faces emerged, new stories claimed the spotlight. Malala remained respected, yes. But the frenzy that once surrounded her began to fade. Journalists called less often. Audiences grew smaller. Some wondered if her time as a symbol was ending. At first, the quiet unsettled her. She asked herself, if the world stops listening, does my work still matter? One evening, while scrolling through news reports, she noticed her name was absent from the headlines. For a moment, a pang of insecurity struck. Then she closed her phone and whispered, Ya Allah, let me remember why I began. Not for fame, not for applause, for truth. She thought back to the little girl in Swat Valley, hiding her books under her shawl. That Malala did not dream of speeches or medals. She only dreamed of learning. And perhaps that was the point. Her mission was never about being seen. It was about being faithful. Her father reminded her gently, the measure of your life is not how loudly the world claps, but how deeply you touch even one soul. She nodded, realizing that fading fame was not failure. It was freedom. Without the crushing glare of cameras, she could work quietly, build schools steadily, live more fully. And still her influence lingered in unseen ways. Letters continued to arrive. A girl from Nigeria thanking her for courage, a teacher in India naming a classroom after her, a refugee in Syria telling her that her story kept her studying in a tent. These were not headlines, but they were history. Malala began to understand. True impact does not need the spotlight. It lives in whispers, in ripples, in the unseen corners where seeds grow quietly. Yet even with this realization, she wrestled with doubt. Will the world forget me? She once asked Asser. He smiled. They may forget the name, but they will not forget the change. And God never forgets the servant who gave her life to His will. Those words gave her peace. She did not need to carry the weight of being remembered. She only needed to carry the weight of being faithful. And so, Malala leaned into the quieter seasons. She poured more into her marriage, into her family, into the quiet joy of simply being Malala. She continued her advocacy, yes, but with less hunger for headlines and more trust in God's timing. She realized that fading from the spotlight did not mean fading from purpose. It meant she could now live closer to the girl she had once been, a girl who loved learning, who loved laughter, who loved the sound of pages turning in the stillness of night. But legacy has its own way of surprising us. Because just when Malala thought the world had moved on, a new generation began to rise. A generation who carried her story not as news, but as a seed of their own courage. Time has a way of turning stories into seeds. And Malala began to see that her own story, once carried by headlines, was now being carried quietly in the lives of others. In 2023, she attended a youth summit in South Africa. She expected to deliver her usual speech, but what moved her most was not her words. It was theirs. Young women from across the continent stood up to speak about their own battles, against child marriage, against poverty, against silencing. One girl from Kenya said firmly, "I fight because Malala fought first." Another from Nigeria lifted her chin and declared, "When Boko Haram came, I remembered her story, and I refused to give up." Malala sat in the audience, tears in her eyes. These girls were not repeating her voice. They were using it as a spark to ignite their own. She realized then that her legacy was not about her name being remembered. It was about courage being multiplied. And she saw that multiplication everywhere. In Lebanon, refugee children gathered in tents, studying by lantern light, whispering her story as if it were a folk tale of survival. In Brazil, activists invoked her words while demanding equal education in favelas. In remote villages of Pakistan, little girls clutched notebooks, telling one another, "We are Malala too." Her story had outgrown her. It no longer belonged only to her. It belonged to the world. But this realization carried a strange mix of comfort and humility. One evening, she confided to her husband, "It feels like I am disappearing into the movement. They don't need my name anymore." Asser smiled. "That is not disappearance, Malala. That is victory. You are not meant to be the light forever. You are meant to kindle lights in others." His words echoed in her heart. She remembered her father's teachings, her prayers in Birmingham, her tears in exile. Perhaps this was what survival had always meant. Not to shine alone, but to make others shine. And so, Malala embraced this new chapter. She began mentoring young activists, not as their symbol, but as their sister. She shared her mistakes, her doubts, her prayers, teaching them not just how to fight, but how to endure. She told them, "Do not try to be Malala. Be yourselves. God did not spare me so that the world would have one voice. He spared me so the world could have many." But even as she passed the torch, Malala carried her own unanswered question. What does God still want of me? For though her story had become seed for millions, she sensed her own path was not yet complete. By 2024, Malala was 26 years old. Still young by every measure of life, yet already carrying the history of someone who had lived through lifetimes of struggle, fame, and survival. She often sat with her journal, pen in hand, staring at the blank page. The question that lingered was always the same. What now, God? What more do you ask of me? She had schools bearing her name. She had given speeches on the world's biggest stages. She had won the Nobel Prize. And yet, inside, she felt her story was not finished. There was something more, something unseen, waiting. Her father reminded her gently, "Daughter, destiny is not always loud. Sometimes it is found in the small, faithful acts that no one sees." But Malala felt a stirring that those small acts might lead her to something larger still. Perhaps politics, perhaps global leadership, or perhaps something entirely unexpected. She prayed for clarity, and though no clear path appeared, she felt a steady whisper in her heart, "Trust me." The story is not over. That year, she traveled to war-torn regions where education had been erased by bombs. In one Syrian refugee camp, she met a mother who clasped her hands with tears streaming down her face. "You are alive because God wanted my daughter to have hope," the mother said. "You were spared for her." Those words shook Malala. They made her see that her survival was not her own to interpret. It was God's gift to others. And as long as children suffered, her mission was unfinished. But she also realized something deeper. Her story was never really about her. It was about what God does when the smallest voice refuses to be silent. It was about how bullets cannot silence truth, and how weakness in human eyes can become strength in divine hands. And so, she began to write her second book, not just about her life, but about the lives of the girls she had met across the world. She wanted the world to see what she had seen, that courage is contagious, and that every story, no matter how small, matters. At night, she sat with Asher, talking about the future, children, family, the balance of home and mission. She laughed softly, saying, "I am still that girl who dreamed of becoming a doctor. Perhaps I will not heal bodies, but I will heal futures." And in those words, she found peace. Because healing futures was, in truth, the purpose God had placed on her life. But even as Malala prepared for what lay ahead, she carried a final question for herself and for the world. When history tells my story, will they see only the girl who defied bullets, or will they see the God who turned a wound into a voice? When Malala looks back on her life, from the narrow valleys of Swat to the grand halls of the United Nations, from the silence of a hospital bed to the applause of world leaders, she sees a story that was never truly her own. It was the story of a father who believed in his daughter when the world did not. It was the story of a valley that lost its voice, but found it again in a little girl's diary. It was the story of a bullet meant to kill, but instead becoming the seed of a global movement. And above all, it was the story of God's hand, unseen but unmistakable. The Taliban asked, "Who is Malala?" when they raised their gun. History answered, "She is the girl who lived so others might learn." But Malala herself would answer differently. She would say, "I am Malala, but I'm also just one of millions of girls who deserve the chance to read, to write, to dream. My life is not special because of what I survived, but because of what God gave me to give away." And so her story becomes our question. Would we have spoken out if silence meant safety? Would we have carried our books if the price was death? Would we have forgiven when hatred seemed easier? These questions linger, not to accuse us, but to invite us. Because Malala's story is not only hers. It is a mirror held up to every soul that wonders, what would I risk for truth? Do I recognize a blessing when it arrives through pain? Her legacy is not a medal, not a title, not even a movement. It is the simple, eternal truth that knowledge is light, that courage can be small and still shake the world, and that God often chooses the weakest vessel to carry his strongest message. Malala once wrote, "Let us remember, one book, one pen, one child, and one teacher can change the world." But perhaps the truer lesson is this: when the world tries to silence you and you still speak, you are already changing it. And so tonight, by the fireside, we close her story, not as a biography of a girl from Pakistan, but as a parable of what God can do with a single, trembling voice. May it remind us to speak when silence is easier, to forgive when bitterness tempts, to dream when fear surrounds, and to trust that no wound is wasted in God's hands. Thank you for sitting with us tonight in the circle of our fireside. If you carry anything from Malala's story, let it be this: courage is not the absence of fear, but the refusal to let fear have the last word. And blessings often arrive in the form of trials we do not understand until years later. If the story touched your heart, share it to the ones you love. And if you would like to listen to more like it, you know where to find us.